In the meantime, whilst it's still Monday night here on 2, Jonathan Porritt hosts a discussion on the future of farming in Britain, voicing the question, where on earth are we going?
British agriculture is one of the great success stories of the last 40 years. After the Second World War, with chronic food shortages and rationing, farmers were asked to produce more food for the nation, and they've done just that. Now, we all enjoy the benefits of that success, but the costs involved in achieving it are only now becoming apparent. Almost intuitively, I think we all recognize that we're living dangerously out of balance with the natural world. Pesticide residues, food irradiation, the loss of priceless, irreplaceable habitats, appalling cruelty to animals, and now mad cow disease. Now, these things are serious problems in themselves, but they're also symptoms of that lack of balance, of our failure to act as stewards of the earth. It's also been a terrible time for farmers, with falling incomes, low public esteem, and a succession of quite excruciating food scandals. But there are alternatives, and it's these that I shall be discussing tonight with Sir Simon Gourlay, President of the National Farmers Union, Professor Philip James, leading nutritionist and director of the Rowett Institute, and Anne Foster, Food Policy Advisor of the National Consumers Council. Just bear in mind when you're watching this film that up to 25% of our farming land will soon become surplus to requirement. Because of increased productivity, we simply need less land to produce the same amount of food. And with new technologies, such as genetic engineering, we'll see fewer and fewer farmers in business every year. That's not only bad news for them, it's bad news for the countryside and for us. The government has responded in a very incoherent way, with a number of desperately underfunded and totally unconnected schemes to try and cope with some of the symptoms of the crisis. But the most promising of these, as I see it, is the Environmentally Sensitive Areas scheme.
Like almost all our countryside, the chalk grasslands of southern England are not exactly natural. Indeed, they're as much the product of our human handiwork as the landscapes of our inner cities. For more than 6,000 years, they've been grazed by sheep, cattle and rabbits, creating ideal conditions for a wonderful array of wildflowers, with more than 40 different species per square metre in places. Farming methods remained largely unchanged until the 1940s, but the post-war drive to produce more food changed all that forever. Though quite unsuitable for growing crops, much of the South Downs grassland was converted to intensive arable production in a mad binge of subsidy-driven vandalism. And with the grassland went its unique flora and fauna. As predicted, soil erosion has also become a serious problem. In places, topsoil has simply been washed away, revealing the bare chalk beneath. On average, the South Downs are losing up to 100 tons of soil per hectare per annum. Hardly what you'd call a sustainable enterprise. In the nick of time, a large part of the Downs was declared an environmentally sensitive area, or ESA, in 1987. Now, this is a small voluntary scheme set up by the government to encourage farmers to go a little greener. Dick Passmore was amongst the first farmers to get on board.
The farm's 1,000 acres. We were growing 650 acres of corn, and the farm basically is a hill farm, rather steep in many places, and fairly expensive to grow corn on in the way of machinery. So the ESA came along. It looked like a good option at the time, and I still think it probably is. So we took it. We're now down to 250 acres of corn, and we've got over 350 acres now into ESA.
ESAs are the last chance we've got of protecting fragile parts of the British countryside, like the South Downs. Here there are two options, or tiers, open to the farmer.
Tier 1 is old pasture, which hasn't been ploughed up. On that 5 acres, we counted 120 different wildflowers growing, and if we put fertiliser on it, obviously we would lose the bulk of these wildflowers. Tier 2 is all arable ground, and we're converting it back to grass, which we can then graze with sheep and cattle, and basically is how it works. Now that is a 5-year contract, so we can't plough it up again for another 5 years, we can't put any fertiliser on it for 5 years, and we can't put any chemicals on it for 5 years.
We've been very pleased with the way in which it's operated, especially on the South Downs. It's achieved a great deal very quickly, much better than, in fact, any other means has been able to achieve. In essence, what it's done is protected all the remaining bits of chalk grassland that we had left on the South Downs and has brought a very large area of land back to grass from arable. It also, I think, has protected a number of other features on the Downs, the landscape and to some extent the archaeology. And farmers have generally taken it up pretty well. It's achieved most of its targets. I think that some farmers probably aren't fully aware of the philosophy behind the ESA, but nonetheless they've seen it as a way of making some money. I think if we could perhaps give them a little bit more information and encouragement in future, then we could improve the system.
No one would deny there are still problems with ESAs. They're underfunded, they're bureaucratic to manage, and they're weak on important environmental criteria. But they're still a damn sight better than MAF's other policy thrust in this area, which is called set-aside. Now, set-aside means paying farmers to take their land out of production altogether for up to 5 years. There are no environmental benefits associated with this whatsoever. Whilst being paid for doing literally nothing on one part of the farm, it makes sense for a farmer to intensify production elsewhere in order to make up for any loss of income. We end up, quite literally, with the worst of both worlds. If one's policy is both to reduce surpluses and to protect the countryside, then it has to make sense to farm the whole acreage less intensively, in an environmentally sensitive way.
We're in a commercial world, and the main external factors are if fertilisers get too dear, the price of corn doesn't go up, and it becomes uneconomic, then it becomes an attractive alternative. And that's really why a lot of us are taking it up now and could become more so.
There were originally 310 sites put forward as environmentally sensitive areas. The Ministry plumped for just 19, covering a minute proportion of the United Kingdom's farming land. Scratching the surface of the problem would be a generous assessment.
We've ended up with a few green ghettos within an intensively farmed factory floor. Now, this path marks the border of the South Downs environmentally sensitive area. Everything on my left falls within it, and the farmer is paid in order to adopt environmentally friendly methods. Everything on my right falls just beyond it, and the farmer receives no such encouragement. Crazy. Now, the obvious answer is gradually to extend the ESA scheme until it covers the whole country. That would, it's true, cost many millions of pounds, but nothing in comparison to the 1.5 billion that is used every year to promote the wrong kind of farming. That inefficient use of subsidy has got the farmer into the mess they're in today. The right kind of subsidy is necessary to help get them out of it. Only then will the farmer be encouraged to adopt environmentally sensitive methods, and only then will the British countryside be adequately protected.
It's perfectly possible, with sensitive management, to integrate the business of food production with a need to act as stewards of the land. There's no reason why the South Downs shouldn't be sustaining farmers for the next 5,000 or 6,000 years at least.
The irony of agricultural policy today is that it all but ignores this stuff, the soil. But from an ecological perspective, the value of any farming method depends upon the way in which it protects and enhances soil fertility. By definition, therefore, modern farming cannot be described as sustainable, because it seeks to replace natural soil fertility with a battery of fertilizers and other chemicals, all of which are derived from fossil fuels, which will, one day, inevitably run out. Worse yet, modern farming treats the soil as some kind of mineral reserve to be mined as intensively as possible. That kind of farming is only as sustainable as the soil is deep, unless you're farming organically.
Organic farming is a term which is commonly used. I prefer to use the word sustainable farming, because that really is what it's all about. I believe that modern conventional farming is more akin to exploitation than it is to farming itself, because in my book, farming is rotations and sustainability. We, for instance, have an 8-year rotation on our farm here at Rushall. 4 years are grass, and 4 years are in corn, cash crops. And the grass is utilized by the cattle, the sheep, and the horses. And during those 3 years of grass, the fertility is built up to enable us to grow the corn. Now, I know the conventional farmers can grow continuous corn every year, but to do that, they depend entirely on very high inputs of chemicals. Well, on an organic farm, on sustainable systems, that can't be done. So you have to build up the fertility in another way, and we do it by means of grass and animals.
If the soil is fertile enough for crops, then it's obviously fertile enough for weeds. But without pesticides, how do you stop these swamping the crops?
What we have to do is to prepare the ground for planting some 10 days or a fortnight before we want to plant it, particularly in the autumn time. The weed seeds in the top 2 inches of the soil will germinate. And then the mechanical action of the drill and harrows which follow effectively destroy them. I won't say it destroys every weed, but we can get very clean crops by using that method.
The amount of pests that we get attacking our crops, it diminishes noticeably from year to year. But overall, I think we have what I like to call a systems approach to pest and disease control. It's not a question of waiting till you get a problem and then responding in terms of applying a cure from a can. You have to start a long way back from that point and really look at your whole system of management of your farm. If you look at a farm as being an agricultural ecosystem, there are very, very important interrelationships between the plants and the insects and the crops in that ecosystem. So we deliberately encourage habitat for beneficial insects, and they are incredibly effective. They really do keep the pest numbers down, and a lot of people are actually surprised when they see how clean our crops are. In some years we can have very, very good yields that are comparable or even exceed expected conventional yields. One of the criticisms that often gets thrown at us as organic producers is, oh well, if we stop using pesticides, Britain would starve. Now, I've actually seen what we can produce without pesticides, and I don't have any worries about being able to produce good quantities of nourishing and healthy food without pesticides. But I think there are implications for the sort of diet perhaps that we eat if there was a massive change to organic methods.
But what about the high prices charged for organic produce?
People can understand a few pennies more, but when you start talking about markups of 200 and 300%, which is what we see on the supermarket shelves, then questions have to be raised about what the breakdown is of that markup and where the money is going. And I can assure you that a lot of the money isn't coming back to the growers and the producers.
Organic produce currently accounts for about 1% of the market, and most of that's imported. Organic farmers are aiming at a target of at least 10% by the end of the decade. But to achieve that, they must have more research and information. Currently, Britain has only one organic research station, Elm Farm in Berkshire.
Compared to the billions that are spent on conventional agriculture by both the government and the agrochemical companies, a pittance is spent on organic farming. We're the only centre in this country carrying out research solely on organic farming, and our budget is around about 200,000 a year. Most European countries have now introduced schemes to support farmers during the conversion from conventional to organic farming. We've got to look seriously at this and introduce measures to help that. It's all very well producing food, but we have to make sure it gets to the consumer in a state where its organic integrity is protected, but at a price that the consumer can afford.
Whenever anyone talks of the efficiency of modern farming, you need to bear in mind the thousands of lorries consuming vast quantities of fuel, driving millions of miles to get the food from the farmer to the supermarket via numerous packaging and distribution centres. This has been described as a distribution miracle. Many see it as a rather more mixed blessing. The food retailing industry in this country is now concentrated in the hands of fewer firms than in any other country in the developed world. We buy more than 70% of what we eat from just 6 major supermarket chains. They offer us convenience, a certain amount of choice, though it's somewhat disturbing to find 10 times as many varieties of cat food on sale as of English apples, and genuine value for money.
Of course, the prices are very competitive. They have to be, otherwise we go elsewhere. But what is it we're actually paying for? Now, the cost of this lettuce, probably no more than 1/10, is the actual cost of production. The rest is down to the washing, sorting, packaging, retailing, marketing, and transportation. Now, these days, there are many more jobs involved in those occupations than there are in growing the wretched lettuce itself, and they all have to be paid for. Now, of course, I know it's much easier for critics like me to take it out on the supermarkets and farmers than to accept that many of the problems about food quality are actually down to us, the consumer.
In France and Italy, there's a very different attitude to food. Consumers are renowned for their fussiness and attention to detail. A far higher proportion of fresh produce is taken directly from the farm to well-established local markets. This not only ensures freshness, but also competitive prices, as the middlemen are cut out. It's also much more energy efficient, as very little transportation is required. I find such a cornucopia of fresh and varied produce positively mouth-watering. And perhaps the key to the success of this system is that there is instant customer feedback. If the produce isn't up to standard, the producer gets to know there and then. In Japan, the situation is much closer to ours, with the supermarkets dominating the distribution system. Japanese housewives are increasingly concerned about food safety and the environment, and many are now signing on with a quite unique initiative called the Seikatsu Club. The club's 170,000 members are mainly women who meet on a weekly basis in groups of 6 to 8 members, or hands, where they make up their orders. Those orders are then processed by computer and fed through directly to the farmers. Club members now buy up the entire output of literally hundreds of farms scattered across Japan. All the produce is organically grown, but what I find particularly interesting is that club members often help out on the farms themselves, creating the most immediate link between producer and consumer.
身近にですね、こういう農地があって、勤められて、消費者の方も身近にいるということで、何か問題があってもすぐ食べてくださる組合員に、問題があった時に相談に行くことができます。畑に、園農に、お手伝いですね。明日皆さんのところへ届く食卓に届く野菜を。
それはもう取ってすぐの配達っていうことですから、市場に出るよりも鮮度もいいし、農薬っていう点でも生産者との話し合いの中でできてますから、そういう点でも安心して大いに食べてます。
Their distribution system is incredibly efficient, with the required produce coming from whichever farm happens to be closest. The club also has its own manufacturing enterprise, producing processed goods and other household items, all of which are produced in an environmentally friendly manner. It's the club members themselves who run all the club's different activities. It seems fairly amazing that individual orders aren't lost during the processing, but just a week after they place their order, hand members at Kawasaki receive their goods delivered to the door. It's clear that the club means a lot more to local members than access to fresh, organic food.
まず最初は非常に安全な食べ物が欲しかったっていうことですね。それとあと便宜上のことを言いますと子供が小さかったもんですからやはり買い物に行くのが大変だったです。それでここまで来てくださるっていうことで随分助かりました。
はい、はい、それからパイン缶が1、はい、はい、 それからトマトピューレが2、
はい、
ほうじ茶1。
一番肝心なことは、現在の環境が汚染されていっている理由の一つに、消費者における責任というものがあります。つまり自分だけが便利で簡単で、そして自分だけが良ければいいというこの消費態度が一つあります。またそういう消費態度に向けて、それをくすぐるような販売政策、生産政策が取られております。今日は大変な消費社会ですから、消費者がそうした点についてきちっとした意思一致をして、そして、生産に対してものを言っていくならば、大きな点で環境に対して私どもは役立つことができるというふうに思っています。
The notion of consumer power, emphasizing the importance of food quality, has to be one of the most hopeful signs for the future. But how can you define quality when describing food? These are the kitchens of one of the world's top chefs. For Raymond Blanc, food quality is the very stuff of life.
We are in the business of excellence, and what I want to give to my guests is the best. And what's the most important, I think, is taste and texture. And I'm afraid now, one look more at the cosmetic or vegetable looks rather than its taste. And in doing so, basically, you have only a lie. Basically, it's very dishonest. It looks all right, but it tastes absolutely nothing at all. And what's happening in the farming industry is absolutely horrible, because they grow these Frankenstein monsters, which looks absolutely great and no taste. Total deceit, total lie. I've been in England now for 17 years, and England has been very kind to me. And I've tried so many farmers, growers, to get the quality produce that I want. And most of the time, failures, because people do not want to bother. 2 years ago, I invited the farmers' unions in my small garden. It's a 7-acre garden. And we grow most of the things which we cannot find in England. And they were quite mesmerized by it, but I wasn't, because they grow like weeds. It's very easy. And one forgets that we could grow those things in England for most of the year.
You don't have to be French, nor a brilliant cook, nor particularly wealthy to care about food quality. The principle is the same whether we're cooking for ourselves at home or eating out. The more stages the basic raw material has to go through before it ends on our plate, the less tasty and the less nutritious the food is going to be. But these days, the emphasis is all on convenience, on quick chill, highly processed, highly standardized foods, and quality goes out the window.
Quality may go out the window, but profits don't. As a general rule of thumb, the more processing that's involved, the greater the opportunity for manufacturers to add cash value to the product, regardless of its nutritional value or environmental value. One of my childhood favorites, fish fingers, sum up this business of added value. They're cheap, convenient, and reasonably nutritious, a firm favorite with kids and busy parents. But the real cost only becomes apparent when you compare them with what we tend to think of as a luxury food, such as fresh salmon, which actually works out cheaper pound for pound.
We really have to change our ideas on food quality in Britain. From the nutritional health standpoint, we've got it all wrong. We're eating far too much fat, far too much sugar, too much salt, and not enough of those foods that give us an appropriate intake of fibre. Now, if you say, why is this? Well, we've actually had our whole understanding of food processing completely out of line, and our agricultural policy is completely wrong. We are producing on the farm far too much fat. The consumer doesn't want it, and that excess fat is going to food products in the food processing industry. It is no wonder that all these hidden sources of fat, sugar, and salt create a huge problem. We have to now ask the question, how do we change agriculture so that it produces what is good for people from a health standpoint, tastes good, and actually provides the nutrients that we need?
The kind of farming that's good for your health is also good for the environment. Fewer chemicals, smaller mixed farms, more fresh fruit and veg, and better quality meat.
Sam Olive's been looking after pigs all his life. He's not only interested in producing high-quality meat, but is committed to rearing his animals in as humane a manner as is possible. In an effort to improve the quality of his meat, Sam has crossed a standard blue with a wild boar. The resulting wild blue is proving to be a great success.
The wild boar, the purpose of wild boar is the quality of the meat. That comes from the fact that wild boar have a smaller fibre in the muscling, that it forms a tighter meat. And so what you have to do is to find a level of feed that grows them and keeps them healthy, but doesn't put on the fat. You see these little chaps here. Now, I mean, they're in good condition. They're getting the feed they need, but they're also outside and they're fit because they're moving, you know, which is what was meant to happen with animals. They weren't meant to lie in one place. All of the four parts of what we've done, the free range, the wild boar, the additive free and the welfare, they all work together to provide the product that the customers wanted in the first place.
I really do believe that eating meat is not itself fundamentally wicked, but should be seen as a real privilege. Sadly, it's the animals which have to pay the cost of our desire for cheap meat, being reared and slaughtered in conditions of utterly immoral cruelty. The ministry does nothing, and we, the consumers, sit passively on the sidelines. Our very humanity is under constant assault.
With less land now needed for arable production, more land is available for extensive or free-range livestock systems, which are both better for the animals and for the consumer. But of course, that's a much more skilled job for the farmer, because you actually have to look after the animals. You can't just pump them full of antibiotics. And that in turn means you have to spend more time with them, which means you have to employ more people, which means that the meat is more expensive. But if that's the cost of producing high quality, humanely reared and humanely slaughtered meat, then that is the price we should be prepared to pay for it.
What you have to do is to have two criteria. That is the quality of life and the manner of death. Nobody knows how long they live. So, I mean, the actual length of life is always questionable anyway. But as long as you've done as well as you can for the animals when they're alive and make sure that they're loaded as quietly, at the abattoir as quickly as possible and killed as quickly as possible, then at least it minimises the unpleasant side of the job.
Someone like Sam Olive reminds us that all farmers have two functions: to produce food and to look after the land and their animals in the process. They're both producers and stewards. Now, before the Second World War, these were one and the same thing. Since then, through a battery of grants and subsidies, farmers have been persuaded to increase production at the expense of everything else, with the effect that we all know on the British countryside and real food quality. Now, it really frightens me that the countryside is being divided up into quite separate zones, with a part of it dedicated to intensive chemical agriculture and factory farming, and another part given over to conservation and the environment, where farmers are paid to act as park keepers without worrying too much about food production. And I find it incredible that farmers are prepared to go along with this. Joining me now are Philip James, Anne Foster and Simon Gourlay. Simon, if I can start with you, don't you think that your members actually would be a great deal better off if they went down the green road rather than the road you're stuck on at the moment?
I think it's questionable, but let's have a look at it, because I'm sure Sam Olive was right. Farmers certainly have two functions. You, Jonathan, I think oversimplify when you talk about, on the one hand, there is highly intensive modern agriculture, on the other hand, park keepers. I would say on the one hand, there's modern conventional agriculture, which is certainly much more intensive than it was. And on the other hand, there are limited number of schemes, like the ESA's, Environmentally Sensitive Area schemes, where farmers are paid to produce on rather the sort of 1920s, 30s style, very much less intensively. But they're not park keepers, they are still producing food.
But that's left us with a kind of, as I said, these little green ghettos, as it were. Because I've talked to any number of farmers over the last few years, and they all say, well, fine, all this conservation stuff. Who's going to pay me not to increase intensity on this bit of the farm?
Well, it's very interesting, but I mean, only last week we had the Stanton Countryside Survey Mark II, which was done on 127 farms in Suffolk. Now, that's not just 127 random farms, 127 out of 130 in a 7-mile square. And, you know, it's very impressive in an arable area what ordinary conventional farmers have been doing by way of planting hedges and trees and making ponds and so on. So I don't think it's just one or the other.
I mean, I forgive an element of skepticism because I think that farmers now are concerned about this, but I do think that the degree of greenspeak is outpacing the degree of actual change on the ground. We still hear terrible statistics about damage to hedgerows and all the rest of it.
And I think some of those statistics are both out of date and some of them are exaggerated, because on this one, on hedgerows, for instance, 5 miles of hedgerows had been either rejuvenated or new ones established. 2 miles had been taken out. There are still some hedgerows coming out, but there's a tremendous lot being done, and this is in a conventional agricultural area of greening of ordinary farming, and I think that that is entirely the right way to go.
Do you think, though, that government's actually doing enough about this? I mean, do you think they should be putting more money into this so-called extensification package so farmers can get the balance right?
They are going to be putting a little bit more money, and I welcome that part of the extensification package, which we should see in operation later this autumn, is one of conversion to organic farming, if they can thrash out the details with Brussels. I think that's a good thing. But I don't think extensification is the way to, as you would put it, de-intensify conventional agriculture, because I believe farmers also, as Sam Olive said, they have to produce the food. They've also got to make a living out of it. And I think that if we spend too much resource de-intensifying agriculture, we suddenly find we haven't got enough reasonably priced food.
And what do you reckon about that?
I think there's still a lot more that can be done. I don't blame farmers for doing what they have been encouraged to do for all of these years. And I think farmers do realise they've got to change, but they've got to be helped, they've got to be encouraged, they've got to be given the financial incentives to do it. It's a major step to take at a time when the industry is going through a very, very vulnerable period.
But then we shouldn't be talking about little sums of money, should we? Shouldn't we be talking about great dollops of money, about redirecting this vast amount of subsidy that still goes into farming, into giving farmers that sense of security?
Oh, until one changes the whole fundamental structure which has created the agricultural setup we have today. Of course, yes. You've got to change, move the big dollops from one form of agriculture to another, but that will take a very long time.
Why? Doesn't it surprise you, for instance, the president of the NFU isn't on a program like this saying, for God's sake, let's have the resources, because we've got the public support to move towards this. Why isn't government prepared to back us now?
Well, we've also got to have Europe, remember. We can't act unilaterally on this. We need to get agreement throughout the whole of the community.
And the ESAs are fine, but you're talking about resources. They are not a very effective use of resources. I mean, I think a lot can be done on a conventional farm. Mine's a conventional farm. It's not highly intensive, but it's a conventional, semi-intensive modern agriculture. But there's a lot of scope for greening of my farm, and I certainly do what I can within the resources of the farm. But government can do a lot within conventional agriculture, much more cheaply than they can do by the ESAs, which are actually very expensive.
Mm. You mentioned organic farming already, which obviously we looked at in great detail in the film. Philip, I wonder if you could just sort of give us your reflections on how important you see organic farming in the food debate, because obviously we look at organic farming both from the land use side of it, the ecological side of it, but there's a very strong health and nutrition aspect as well, isn't there?
Well, I'm not particularly impressed by the organic farming argument, because we know that, 2% of all farmland now, it'll go up maybe to 10%. It's really only going to make a minute contribution to solving the problem, and I think that we ought to not be concentrating on organic farming as such. I think we'd be much better to do what Simon's talking about, which is to look at the present structure of the majority of farms and say, what is wrong with it? How can we change it? How can we go about it? That means a whole series of things. If you're going to generate new policy, you've got to have proper analysis based on facts. And at the moment, if you're going to tie in the economics of agriculture with concepts of quality food, which I tend to think of as nutritional quality, then in fact you've got a real conundrum which we haven't begun to sort out.
But 10% for organic is hardly tiny, and that may be 10% by the end of the century.
What I'm worried about is the other 90%, you see.
Sure, but that's another thing for us to consider as well.
All right, but I think that why not tackle the 90% and give that at least as much emphasis as is now being given, superficially, I agree,
exactly,
to organic farming.
Because you're going to need the 90%. The world's population is still expanding. And although we want to improve agricultural production in those areas of the country, of the world where there's still any subsistence levels of nutrition, we want to improve them there. we are going to need the techniques available to modern conventional agriculture to feed the world. I've no doubt about that at all. So the 90% is going to be extremely important. And I believe that we do need measures to green the 90%.
But do I gather from that that both of you think that organic could never cater for 100% of the food needs of this
Only
country?
with a very significant change in the diet. It could
Of what
probably
kind?
then. Well, I think that meat would have to go
Isn't
very
this better
largely
for
out of
diet
the
then?
blender.
No,
No,
I mean,
certainly
the
not.
modern concepts of nutrition are not specifically anti-meat, they're anti-meat fat. And I think that one would have to do a lot in terms of marrying concepts of organic with modern concepts of nutrition. I mean, let's face it, the current structure of agriculture post-war was based on nutritionists and medicos and politicians getting together in the Second World War, developing a fantastic policy which emphasized the importance of producing milk, meat, and in effect lots of fat. And now we've got a particular structure with huge capital investment, and how to restructure that, take account of major environmental issues. It's an enormous challenge that we're not beginning to tackle.
I think this also fits in with what the majority of consumers want. We know that the demand for organic food is going to be limited, and at present price levels, I can see why. I think what the majority of consumers want is to feel that their food is being produced in a more responsible way, so that there's more selective use of, for example, pesticides. I think they would like to feel that this responsibility is taking place, and it doesn't necessarily mean they have to go and buy organic. It means that they are just more comfortable with the methods of production of their
I'm
normal
sure that's
days.
the way things are going to go. We're going to see more greening, not only countryside greening of conventional farms, but more greening of conventional farming. You're already seeing it with the word traditional coming into some of the major supermarkets. Traditional means that, for instance, the pigs are kept outside. They're still fed conventionally, but they're kept outside. They're still fairly intensive, but they are kept to a certain standard, they're fed to a certain standard, certain things excluded from the diet, they're medicated to a certain standard, and the slaughterhouse procedures and curing procedures are to a certain standard. They are greener, but it's a long, long, long way from organic.
Simon, concerns have changed. I mean, the consumers used to care about quantity and price. Those days are quite a long way behind now. Then I'm much more concerned about processes. How were the animals reared?
Indeed, well, I'm delighted about that, obviously, because that's very much what we would be trying to advocate. But the use of the word traditional doesn't fill me with much joy. I mean, you can use that word for anything. You can have a traditional battery farm, as far as I know. And I fear that the consumer won't be quite as persuaded as you seem to think they're going to be, merely because you stick the word traditional on it. They're very confused.
They want to know what
clear
traditional
labeling.
means. I mean, no more farmers, consumers impressed these days by farm fresh,
No,
because you see
quite
farm
rightly.
fresh going down the road, and it means absolutely nothing at all. It's got to be linked with a certain standard, but clearly there are certain of the supermarkets, for instance, one in particular that is using the word traditional, and it's quite clearly linked to certain standards which are there for the consumer to see.
I must say, I do have enormous concern about the use of the words traditional and natural and the kind of health and nutrition claims that we're seeing. And Simon's right, they've got to be backed by a standard. That's what's very good about the labelling of organic produce. It is backed by a standard which everyone has agreed. But I think if we use these other words too often, they will become devalued and consumers will simply become cynical about them.
But that implies that you have to have a scheme whereby you know what organic means, you know what traditional means, you know what all these other things mean. I mean, the poor old consumer is going to have a terrible time soon, because they're going to have to choose whatever it is 10 times over, organic, traditional, and so on. And I think that I would guess that the 90% is going to shift much more towards the environmentally responsive and sensitive, and that's actually going to be the main effect over the next 10 years. But at the moment, it's incoherent because there's no planning and no strategic assessment of what's required.
The tendency in the debate has always been to blame government for not doing more about nutritional standards. Do you think that's all there is to it? I mean, how much do you actually think the consumer needs to put the pressure on the producer to ensure higher nutritional standards?
Well, I think that the consumer has put pressure on the producer, and if you look at the astonishing changes in pig rearing over the last 10 years, then you see its effects. One of the problems has been that government policy locked in from 1940s, 1950s
has given financial incentives which are totally counter to the nutritional demand. That's beginning to change. As soon as it changes, the farmer will respond. And that's the problem. We have an incoherent approach to what is obviously a major problem.
Take the example of pigs there. How did the consumer, as it were, bring that pressure to bear back on the producer?
Well, because they refused to buy bacon if there was an enormous amount of fat on it. That led to a huge change in the pig industry, and that's where the Danes came in with such...
So where are the next sectors of change going to be, where nutrition concerns, food quality concerns, work their way back to the farmers so that they begin to respond to that market pressure? How would you identify those new areas?
Oh, I think that what's going to happen is that the retailers are taking an increasing role in specifying what the producers actually produce in discrete, organized chains. And retailers are very consumer sensitive, and they are specifying higher and higher standards. And I think that's going to be the mechanism, bypassing all these intermediate middlemen. And that's going to actually lead to quite a lot of change.
But does bypassing the middlemen, presumably that means more money coming back to the farmer, which seems to me to be pretty critical to anything that's going to happen in the 90s.
Well, clearly, farming is a business, and no business can go on indefinitely unless it's making money. There's nothing evil about making a profit, and farmers have got to try and make a profit to service their business. Only actually, if they're making a reasonable profit, like any other business, can they invest in the sort of equipment necessary to de-intensify or whatever the case may be. If you want different standards of pig husbandry, if the consumer wants different standards of flock husbandry for poultry, then it requires investment. It can only be done by a business that's making money. And I think that the leading retailers recognize this, and they are, as Philip says, they are the very effective policemen between the primary producer and the consumer.
Can I just put you on the spot for a moment? Do you actually think that this reconciliation between food production and proper management of the land can be catered for purely by market forces?
No. When you take farming, as in the European community, still about 9 million individual businesses, I think there has to be an overall framework, and it isn't going to be a market forces framework if we're going to see a sensible evolution of structure and of greening of the countryside.
It's got to be market-led, it's got to be market-driven, and it can be, because when consumers do have choice, they will often choose the products which they believe to meet their nutritional needs more adequately. For example, they've had the choice in skimmed milk and full-fat milk. They've had choice between wholemeal bread and white bread, and there are clear trends. But when the consumers lead the market, it's then got to be followed up by the changes in the structure, not lumbering along years behind. That's the problem. We're always trying to catch up.
Preferably anticipating it.
But Anne, you were saying a minute ago that organic produce is hard for most people to be able to purchase because of the premium on it.
Yes.
Now, I agree with you, but other people who can't, if you like, afford organic food at the moment are dependent, therefore, upon knowing that their food does not contain pesticide residues. So surely
well, they can be now, for pity's sake. I mean, the pesticide residue standards are extremely tight.
Yes.
So that everybody knows that food from conventional agriculture conforms to those standards.
Everybody has been told that.
And let's face it, there have been some cases where organic food has got extremely high levels of certain, what you might describe as chemicals in.
But what I'm saying is that a market-led system cannot necessarily ensure that you get these higher standards benefiting everybody. And surely concerns about the countryside, for instance, are very hard to represent in the market. How do I go along and put my money on the table for a beautiful view or the maintenance of wetlands? Where do I put my money for that?
I think you're being too idealistic in your argument. Consumers can achieve enormous changes. They did, for example, with the use of additives. They can continue to do that. What they can't do is look at an individual fruit or vegetable and see whether or not it's got pesticides. Of course they can't. They can't detect residue levels. What they've got to do is have faith in the systems which are controlling applications such as that. Now, if they don't have faith in the systems, that's where the problems lie.
It is sometimes quite hard to have faith in the systems, isn't it, when you're dealing with the Ministry of Agriculture? I mean, let's be honest, they hardly seem to conjure up an immense amount of confidence amongst people. None of you so far have, as it were, put the boot in on the Ministry of Agriculture. Maybe you've all got good reasons not to do so, but it does seem to me they're at the heart of many of our problems.
It's actually the Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, to give it its full title, and I see absolutely no conflict in that. I mean, it is suggested and has been over the last couple of years that it's quite incompatible that a Minister of Agriculture can also be a Minister of Food and vice versa. I see nothing wrong in that at all, because as a farmer, I've learned, certainly if I didn't know it before over the last couple of years, that if I produce something which the consumer does not believe is safe, the first person that's going to suffer is probably me more than the consumer. And so there is no inherent conflict. Where there is a conflict and where the government doesn't get its act together is, and where also, if you think of the notion of a food safety agency that's totally separate from government and totally separate from the ministry, is that you're still going to need government departments to maintain standards and to coordinate their act on those things. You need the Department of Health, you need the Department of the Environment, and so on.
You've been fairly critical about some of the restructuring of the more changes within the Ministry of Agriculture. Are you happy with the structure we've got at the moment?
Not entirely, no. I think there has been a tremendous loss of confidence in the ability of the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food to maintain the standards that consumers accept. There have been a series of problems now over the past 2-3 years which have simply shaken this fundamental confidence. I actually agree with Simon that the perception that the ministry was there to promote the producer interest only is perhaps a mistaken one, because I think we're seeing more and more now that in fact the tremendous common ground between the producer interest and the consumer interest. But I still think there are some fundamental problems. I mean, the first is the division of responsibility for food safety between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Department of Health. And it's a nonsensical division.
It's a big problem, though. I would agree that if you keep the producers and the food processors and the consumer interest all together, that in theory is fine. What we've got to see is a cultural change in MAF, in my opinion, such that it's overt that, in fact, the consumer's interest is coming first. It's said so. Why don't the consumers believe it? MAF has got to do enough for the consumers actually to be absolutely convinced that their interest is coming first.
I think it's only appropriate that a discussion like this is going to bring it back to the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, but I think that's all we've got time for tonight. Simon, Anne and Philip, thank you very much.